Hello and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn, and we're in the middle of a three-part series on Mormon Stories. The first 2 hours of this series were spent with the wonderful John Hamer, who is a former member of the LDS Church, a current member of the Community of Christ, and we talked quite extensively about his journey, his appreciation for the church as a youth and as an adolescent, but his decision to leave the church, and what brought him back into Mormonism as a culture, and ultimately what led him back into a position of what I would call faith, and into his decision to actually join or affiliate with the Community of Christ, which was formerly named the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was sort of a competing branch of the Restoration that came out of Joseph Smith's Martyrdom, and the Community of Christ is a fascinating church. And I started following them a few years ago when I met Bill Russell, and I even released one of his interviews or speeches on the podcast. But the Community of Christ is fascinating for a multiple set of reasons. Not only is it sort of impossible to be a member of the LDS Church without really, it's impossible to fully appreciate LDS Church history without understanding, I believe, the Community of Christ history, because I believe they're interwoven, and we'll probably see that today. But I also believe that the Community of Christ is just this inspirational example of not only staying true to many of Joseph Smith's fundamental teachings about ongoing revelation and an open canon and many other types of things that we'll talk about, but also it feels to me as though the Reorganized Church sort of encountered and stared head on many of the intellectual and cultural issues in the 60s and 70s that the LDS Church is only getting around to facing, in the 2000 teens. And, the Community of Christ is still making positive changes recently, even as recently as the past couple of years. And in many ways, I guess if we as LDS Church members want to see our future or learn about how we might optimally navigate our future, we have a lot to learn from the Community of Christ. So for all those reasons, for the next hour or two, we are going to have this amazing presentation by John Hamer. It's on YouTube, so those of you who are just listening through audio, you're going to miss out on the full experience if you don't watch the YouTube version, because John Hamer is a gifted map maker and a gifted graphic designer. And every one of these historical points that we're going to cover is going to is going to have visual aids that really help us understand the history of the Community of Christ, and in many ways the history of the LDS Church. And so we're going to cover that for the next hour or two, and then we're going to conclude with a discussion about where the Community of Christ is now. They have an exciting new program to reach out to people who no longer feel like they can maintain affiliation with the LDS Church. And personally, I'm just a fan of faith. I'm a fan of religious affiliation when it works for people. And so I want to make sure people know about it, because it's very relevant, and I think it means to do really good things, and I would love to see it succeed. So with all of that, John Hamer, welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Thanks, John. That was a great introduction, and hopefully, I think when I've done a lot of the different study of the different smaller Latter-day Saint tradition churches, and I could talk about, let's say, Strangites and Cutlerites, and people I think are endlessly fascinating. They want to know more about Cutlerites, but then if you ever start talking about the Reorganized Church, people I think are in either they have a negative opinion or they think it's going to be boring. They're bored by the idea of it. But I think that I like your introduction. I think that, in fact, it's not only is it a fascinating story, but it is totally intertwined with the LDS, mainline LDS story, and actually had a lot of effect on where the Mormon Church is today.
For sure. And I'll just say that I was as inspired when I read about how the Community of Christ handled its intellectual and cultural issues starting in the 60s, I was as inspired by its history as I was by, I don't want to say Martin Luther King Jr., but Malcolm X, or many great historical figures who we know as doing very courageous and bold things. I sort of look at the Community of Christ or the Reorganized Church as in some ways an institutional embodiment of character and integrity and a love of truth and of honesty. And I'm deeply inspired by them to this day. And so, yes, I urge my listeners to give this history their full attention and consideration, because there's much to be inspired by here. How's that?
Perfect.
All right. So we've got these visuals. We're on YouTube for those who want to watch. Got some beautiful pictures, but let's launch in. John, I'll just have you tell me next slide or next image, and that'll be my cue to advance it here as I'm navigating this multimedia production. So,
all right. So I just have it up on my side too, and so I'll just look at where I'm at.
Okay. Excellent.
Okay. So after the title slide, I think we go right into this idea that I have just as an introduction. So I talk about the history of the different Latter-day Saint tradition churches, the many churches that exist within the overall banner or the overall religion of Mormonism. And when I do that, I find that actually, in a general audience, there's very little awareness that there are multiple denominations within that religion. But so then a lot of times I bring up, okay, well here, if you never have thought about that before, and maybe even a lot of people in the mainline church, the LDS Church, haven't thought about it too much. There may have been some awareness more recently with news like Warren Jeffs and the raid down in El Dorado, Texas, where the children were taken from the polygamists by the Texas authorities. There may be some awareness that, okay, there are a group of people who are practicing polygamy who are a Mormon tradition faith, but obviously who aren't in the same church that, say, Mitt Romney is in, or the people who are the young men who in twos, ride on bicycles up to your door and knock on your door and want to ask you about the Mormon church. So that there's obviously at least that much of a difference. And then there is some awareness sometimes, especially in the Mormon church. Well, there are also these reorganized Mormons, and there's something about, I heard something about them. They changed their name, Community of Christ, maybe. There may not be too much more awareness than that, though.
And sometimes, as you kind of referred, I always thought of the RALDS Church prior to becoming more informed as kind of the losers. They're like these, these kind of step cousins that really aren't legitimate, and they totally lost, but they're still trying to maintain their legitimacy. But it is its own very rich tradition with very inspirational cultural elements and historical happenings.
Well, you're definitely your poor cousin, right? So there's the rich cousin that has,
right.
And then there's cousins who let's say have a different tradition of tithing paying, where you don't have to pay 10% before taxes,
right?
And so therefore they don't have your cousins who don't have any money, but it doesn't mean that they don't have that doesn't mean they don't have, like you say, a rich tradition that goes all the way back to the same starting point.
Yeah, and much that we can learn and be inspired from. Yep.
So let's go on to the next one. And so what I actually then would like to point out is that, in fact, in the, what do I call, the Constellation of Mormonism, or the denominations that make up Latter-day Saint tradition churches, there are, in fact, lots of different churches that are not in communion with each other. And so obviously the one that everyone is very aware of, the LDS Church, and I'll use that terminology, even though Latter-day Saint is somewhat common to the whole movement. I'll just say LDS Church to refer to the church that's headquartered in Salt Lake City that Thomas S. Monson is the president of. The LDS Church has millions of members. The Community of Christ, who we're talking about today, has hundreds of thousands of members, so it's much smaller. But then there are a group of churches that have in the thousands, and so these include some of the ones that we're aware of. So the FLDS Church, which is one of the fundamentalist Mormon churches, polygamous churches, and then also other Midwestern churches, including the Temple Lot Church that people may be aware of because of their strategic location on the Temple Lot and Independence, and some of the other churches. And so in general, as we kind of try to count them up, there's perhaps today 80 different expressions that are not in communion with each other, but are still large enough to have an active congregation. So there's many more than that if you're going to count expressions down to the individual person who is not in communion with anybody but may still be a restoration believer of some kind. But it's impossible at a certain point to start. There's people. Steve Shields has a book called Divergent Paths of the Restoration, and he does a heroic task of trying to get down to every individual person who's an independent believer. But I try to group it here to people who have an expression that's large enough that they have a church.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. So let's go in the next slide then. So when we think about this, then what do these all have in common as a religion? And so at their origin, these all go back to the Restoration. They all go back to the publication of the Book of Mormon, and also to the one of the founders of the movement, the founding prophet Joseph Smith. And so let's go on.
Okay.
But Joseph Smith, during his lifetime, during his ministry as a leader of the early church, this is kind of my attempt to make it's a timeline and a kind of a schematic diagram map of the church during Joseph Smith's ministry. So the church isn't just in one particular place. It's not just one thing that's exactly the same throughout the entire time period. It's a thing that is where its headquarters is moving. It's moving from New York to Kirtland to Missouri to Nauvoo. What we often don't think about when we just have a very simplified map is that throughout almost the entire Kirtland period, there is another simultaneous nucleus of believers that are existing in Missouri, so that the Missouri period and the Kirtland period more or less overlap the whole time. And ultimately then the Nauvoo period. And then the thing that always gets left out whenever historians are telling the story of the church, I mean, we tend to write this thing as if it was just Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith. The story of the church is the Joseph Smith story. But if the story is told in any wider way, it's talking about the headquarters location and what's going on at headquarters. But throughout the entire period of time, the bulk of the membership is going to be spread around in all of these little branches throughout the Midwestern and Eastern United States, especially, and then ultimately in Britain, where and other places like that, where local members are organized into congregations called branches. And one of the things I'm showing here with this diagram is that as more and more things are being revealed, as the prophet is constantly restoring things or adding new practices, and as the church is evolving, I'm doing that by color here, from kind of a New York blue era to ultimately kind of a Nauvoo yellow era, that the people, let's say, if you're with Joseph Smith in Kirtland, you're getting different teachings than the people 800 miles away down in Missouri are getting. And so then when the church in Kirtland collapses and Joseph Smith and Sidney Ridgon and the other leaders make it to Missouri, that changes. There's a big abrupt thing that happens. So all the witnesses of the church, all the leaders of the church in Missouri get kicked out at that moment. And then likewise, what I'm showing then with the branches is if you're just experiencing this by missionaries coming through every once in a while, and also by receiving the church newsletter, newspapers, the Times and Seasons and the preceding newspapers, your awareness of where the church is at, especially in Nauvoo, when Joseph Smith is taking a select inner core and teaching practices in secret to them, you are not on the same page with what's happening in the immediate circle of Joseph Smith out in the branches.
And I don't know if you're planning on covering this as well, but it's just important to realize how much the church changed just from the time of 1830 to Joseph's martyrdom. So, for example, a really basic thing that I didn't know for many years was that the actual name of the church itself changed. Is that true? So,
Oh, absolutely.
so like,
Yeah.
give us an example. So,
Well, so we'll there and is at the end when because the RLDS Church has a couple additional name changes, right?
okay,
So
okay, right,
so I will have that, but just as a simple one, when the church is founded or when the church is organized, because we use the word, it was important to them that it wasn't founded. It was simply the existing Church of Christ from ancient time, from the first century Palestine. It had fallen into disorder. It had been called Church of Christ, the Church of Christ. And so, as restorationists influenced by other restorationists like Alexander Campbell, who also believed that the church should only be called by that scriptural name, Church of Christ. That was the name that the church was organized under in New York. Unfortunately, that name was taken by a lot of people, especially the disciples of Christ, the Church of Christ that Alexander Campbell had founded. And so everybody who wasn't in the church immediately called the people in the church Mormons or Mormonites, which nobody ever liked. And to this day, a lot of the different Latter-day Saint tradition churches reject the name Mormon, including Community of Christ, which people in Community of Christ don't think of themselves as being Mormons. But it is always an exterior name, and there's a kind of a love-hate relationship that people in the LDS Church have had with it at different times. So I know that my grandparents, who were old members, they would always write Mormon in quotes, when they were saying Mormons, right? They didn't consider that to be their name. So, possibly in a way to combat this being called Mormons thing, they decided in Kirtland, right before they went out on the science camp military march to try to restore the people to Jackson County who'd been kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri. Right before this long 800-mile militia march, they changed the name of the church to Church of the Latter-day Saints. So that was the second name of the church, Church of the Latter-day Saints. And so that created this new brand identity, Latter-day Saint, which that has been, let's say, more widely embraced by most of the branches. But for a whole bunch of people, that change was that was totally unscriptural. So suddenly, Christ's true church, this original church, which was known scripturally as the Church of Christ, now it's the Church of the Latter-day Saints. This is the exact problem why we don't believe Presbyterian Church is the right church. It's not, Church of Christ is not called the Methodist Church. It's called the Church of Christ. And so this was rejected by many people. And so many times when early saints, they didn't call themselves saints, when the early members of the church rejected that, they would go back and they would rename the church Church of Christ, which is the original name. So as a compromise, in Missouri in 1838, the new name got founded by revelation, so Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and even then, the spelling isn't standardized until after Joseph Smith's death. So in Utah, that ends up becoming Latter-little d Saints, Day Saints,
right.
And then in other churches like the Reorganized Church, it's space, no dash, big capital D. Day Saints, the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So anyway, it's a complicated, messy thing, but the main point there, as I think your point you were making, is the church itself during Joseph Smith's lifetime it's a moving target. It's not all in one place. It's not all one thing. There's new things that are happening, and you cannot. No one church after Joseph Smith's death can embrace the entire Joseph Smith experience because there's too many competing things.
Yeah, and I don't want to extend this too long, but I mean, even if you look at the doctrine and theology in the Book of Mormon, that probably maps relatively closely to the doctrine and the theology of Kirtland. It is very different, and in some ways, oppositional to a lot of the doctrine and theology we'd find in Nauvoo.
Yes.
And we all think that Joseph, with the Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood, that was all laid out from the very beginning, and that there were deacons and teachers and priests at 12, 14, and 16 passing the sacrament. And, the Melchizedek priesthood was really clear. In reality, the first several years of the church, as I understand it, no one even knew anything about the Melchizedek priesthood or its foundings. And many of the really early church leaders were surprised when they heard Joseph claim that he had been visited by Peter, James, and John, because no one knew about that. And so
that's right.
Major fundamental changes, even within 5-year periods within Joseph Smith's lifetime.
Absolutely.
Okay,
That's
so I don't want to
exactly right.
belabor that point, but I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
No, I think that's really important. I think that's a great point to make. And so all of those things, like you say, so if you were a person like David Whitmer, who signed up for a very early phase of Mormonism, over time, a lot of these things started becoming uncomfortable to you. So he was a restorationist. He believed in this name, the Church of Christ. He actually is converted to Mormonism before there is a Book of Mormon, right? So he's converted during the translation period, and so he is very kind of. It's important to him, the seer stone portion, the receiving revelations through stones, and so later when he gets kicked out of the church in Missouri, he continues to be a believing member, a believing faithful adherent to the Restoration. He wouldn't call it to the Latter-day Saints because he doesn't approve of that name change. And later, when he restores or reorganizes his own church, a Whitmerite Church of Christ. He calls it the Church of Christ. And one of the things that David Whitmer does in that is the Church of Christ has as a practice receiving revelation through seer stones. And so he and the other church members in his Whitmerite church, continue to emphasize then that early portion of Mormonism, that kind of New York period, and not obviously he wasn't even around for the Nauvoo period.
Yeah, and another example would be that the original Book of Commandments actually forbade polygamy explicitly, which is very different from the way polygamy was allowed, in the early 1840s, right?
Well, so it's the original. Well, the Book of Mormon condemns it,
Right.
and
That's right. That's right.
And the Book of Mormon actually, that quotation from the Book of Mormon was actually the very first. So the LDS Church was essentially is the anti-polygamy faction of the early church,
Yeah.
and so the anti-polygamy faction of the early church, when they published their first newspaper, what they called the True. It's a very argumentative, polemical title, the True Latter-day Saints Herald, which is now just called the Herald. The masthead, above the masthead, is this quotation from the Book of Mormon that there shall be none among you that be save it one wife, and of concubines you shall have none, or something, right?
Right.
So it's like a quotation from the Book of Mormon, and that was the masthead. It was so important.
But the only
and then
reason
like you say, the Doctrine and Covenants. There's a section in the Doctrine and Covenants, which was the section on marriage, which says, inasmuch as this church has been beset with rumors about polygamy, we declare that it's only right to have like one man and one woman or whatever as marriage, right? And so that was in the original Doctrine and Covenants, and that was in the Doctrine and Covenants in the Utah Church all the way up until way later than you'd imagine. I don't know the exact date, but it's in the 50s or 60s or something when they take that section out and add D&C 132 in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants into that.
That's right. But these are sometimes oppositional doctrines or teachings.
That's right.
Depending on what point of the church you're in. Okay, I've deterred us long enough. Let's keep going.
Yeah. Well, so that brings us right into the next slide.
Okay.
So that's because there are these just tensions that exist inherently in Mormonism. So on the one hand, we have continuing revelation. But on the other hand, we have this notion that the revelation is the restoration of an ancient order of things. And so that every single thing that we may have revealed at any given time actually is this thing that has existed for all times. And so then the problem then is if you restore the name of the church has to be Church of Christ, and then you later restore that the name is Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which of those is the ancient order of things? If you restore that all of the offices of the church are complete as priesthood, which is teacher, priest, and elder, and that's it. And then you later, like you point out, okay, well, no, in fact, elder is part of this Melchizedek priesthood, and we also have high priests, and we also have all these other offices that aren't in the scriptures, for example. Which one of those was the ancient order of things? And so that is a tension that affects people throughout the entire dynamic period of Joseph Smith's ministry, when revelations in some cases and innovation are a mile a minute. So it's just going on and on and on, and things are very different in 1844 than they were when David Whitmer had joined the church.
Right.
And then the simultaneous thing that we have here also, though, is this idea that there is one prophet, and then there's also personal revelation that everybody's receiving. And that's continuously also a tension, where people like David Whitmer believed that everybody could be receiving revelations. And at a certain point, there's different tests of will and power tests where at some point, in order to function, Joseph Smith slowly asserts more and more and more control in the course of those 14 years, where it more authority and more control is in the hands of the single prophet, the president of the church.
And that may have even started with Hyrum Page, right?
Right, all the way back, yeah.
Right, it's
so. I mean, at first there's this idea that's actually very kind of inclusive to this revelation to Oliver Cowdery. You have the gift of doing this too. You can be the one. You can be inspired and be providing inspired translation or composition of the Book of Mormon text itself. But then soon after the organization, or in the next little phase, when there's Hyrum Page, who's one of the other Whitmer in-laws, is taking that license and maybe now potentially injecting chaos into the church by, if everybody is all receiving these revelations, is there any individual? Is there a focus? So
right.
It's a tension.
These are great tensions.
Yeah.
Okay. And I would even add, maybe, I don't want to add to your slide, but I think Joseph not only, one other tension might have been Joseph as leader versus having multiple leaders and distributed authority within the church. And even the tensions between the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency in the modern LDS Church. There seems to be tension about to what extent are we going to distribute authority in the church, right?
Right. Oh yeah, that totally could fit into the one prophet personal revelation thing, which is existing right at the beginning, which is the prophet and is receiving revelation for the church. On the other hand, there's the idea that the church is entirely organized by common consent.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
And so where is that line too? Is the line closer to whatever theodemocracy, or is it closer to theo-viceroyalty, where the prophet is the vicar or the viceroy of Christ on earth, or is it where the people are democratically all receiving revelation together as God's constitutional monarchy?
Yeah, and the remnants of that is just in the modern LDS Church, where we all sustain people, but you never hear an objection, and the votes don't seem to really count. So there's sort of this... And
the alternate way that could be taken is what happened in Community of Christ, which is that when we have our general conference, which now is called World Conference, that everybody who goes to general conference is not just going to a big church meeting. It's rather in every local, what they're called mission centers now, but anyway, functionally it'd be like stakes or mission districts of the church. They send delegates to the conference, and the conference itself has motions, and the conference itself is essentially the supreme governing body of the church. So the more emphasis anyway on the by common consent side of it, as opposed to the rule of the prophet directly.
And the votes are actually tallied and counted, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yeah. No, and motions pass and fail and all that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right.
So here's another illustration. So we talked about in the next slide. So we talked about the name of the church changing. Another one, we just touched on this. So this is like a contrast between the 1830 hierarchy and what had emerged by 1835. So we mentioned that with the emergence of the different priesthood offices. And so initially, we really only have, when the church is organized, we have elders, priests, and teachers. Elders are said to be equivalent of apostles, so all the elders who are going around are functionally apostles, and their only position that we have in terms of hierarchy is that in a kind of an undifferentiated or not particularly explained way, Joseph Smith is the first elder among the elders, first among equals or something possibly, and then Oliver Cowdery is like the second elder among the elders.
And so elder in the original usage of it was not a Melchizedek priesthood office, first of all.
Right. That's right.
And I don't see deacons here at all.
There were no deacons yet. That's later.
Yeah, that's crazy. and so there's no mention of Melchizedek priesthood in those first 5 years.
I don't know the exact timeline of when. It's like what ends up happening is there at some point or other there's a difference between the higher priesthood and a lesser priesthood. And so that's like so initially in a later evolution between these two pieces. So I'm doing here between 1830 and 1835. There are some transitional moments in between.
Sure.
And so what ends up happening is there's what's called a higher priesthood, which is ultimately becomes like the Melchizedek priesthood. But first, there's no difference between being a high priest and just holding the higher priesthood.
Right.
So later, the higher priesthood is equated with the Melchizedek priesthood, and then elder gets moved from being in the lesser priesthood to being into the higher priesthood, which is the Melchizedek priesthood.
The office of elder gets promoted.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, after having been demoted.
Right.
So yeah. And so then anyway, just like you say, fast forward here to 1835, this structure is wildly different. So we have now a first presidency, 3 presidents, a president, and 2 counselors. We have a presiding patriarch or evangelist. Those terms are used interchangeably. We have these councils of high priests who we now have in the LDS Church. There's retained in the form of stake high councils and also the 12 apostles. And so there's the headquarters high council at Kirtland. There's the high council of the church at Missouri, and then there's the traveling high council of the church, which are the 12. And so they are in charge of things that they're even in charge of like the budget. They're in charge of anything that's like a court case. The presidency, at some points, if they want to have funding for something or if they want to build a temple or something like that, they go to the high council, and the high council votes to approve funds or something like that. So there's things that the high councils are doing that we don't have as much anymore. There's this presidency of the church in Missouri, which is the forerunner of stake presidencies that have emerged. There's bishops that have emerged. At the time, bishops are not the leaders of congregations. The bishops are financial officers. They're in charge of the temporal affairs because the church is also having economic communal experiments, and so the bishops and bishoprics are in charge of property, and then the apostles in the 70s are specifically in charge of the missionary program.
What would an 1835 Mormon call the head of their congregation?
You would either say pastor, or you would say presiding elder, or branch president. And so I think that
that's crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah. No, yeah. If you one of the things that the churches usually when Mormons hear about anything that Community of Christ does that's different from what happens in Utah, then people immediately assume that the Community of Christ is the one that has changed, because you always assume that what you're doing is exactly the same all the way back. You're talking about 12-year-old deacons and stuff. Well, the deacons are not 12 years old until Utah. That's a Utah innovation. Deacons were regular adult members in all the different branches spread all around, male members.
And in some ways, it's the Utah church that's changed, not the Community of Christ.
That part changed, yeah. And then the same thing with pastors. So if you read the article of faith that we believe in the same organization that existed in the primitive church, these apostles, priests, pastors. Pastors is one of those things that's in that list. Mm-hmm. Except for there are no pastors, right? In the LDS Church, even though that's in the
Article of Faith, yeah.
Article of Faith, right? Yeah. Well, so anyway, so that's a change. And same thing, the presiding patriarch, that's now been phased out in the LDS Church. Right. And then also, for example, the first presidency here, the council itself has no relationship to the Council of 12 Apostles, which is a completely different body. But now the first presidency in the LDS Church is the president itself of the first presidency is the senior most apostle, and then they pick counselors traditionally now based from the other members of the 15 apostles.
Yeah. Yep. So. Yeah, radically different structures even within a 5-year period.
Yeah. Yep. So that's what I'm just trying to say here in this case, is that there is this is a moving target, and if you want to, it is completely possible, like David Whitmer did when I was talking about the Whitmerite Church, to want to go back and replicate the original organization and say that is in this grab bag of Mormon heritage, and that was a completely legitimate thing that I remember doing that I found was spiritually meaningful, and that's what my Whitmerite Mormon Church is going to emphasize.
Right, got it. Okay,
so the next slide. So this thing here is kind of a crazy one. So let's take those people. Every one of those things that were green on the preceding slide, where we have the first presidency, the Missouri presidency, the apostles, the Kirtland bishop, everybody. If we go then and we go fast forward to 1847, when Brigham Young in Council Bluffs reorganizes his faction and creates a new first presidency for the first time. So in this interregnum that happens after the martyrdom, he has been functioning as acting church president for the Nauvoo church, and he's been busily moving everybody to the west. In the meantime, though, there hasn't been a functional first presidency. So when he decides that they are going to reorganize and have a new first presidency, what I've done here then is taken all of those people from 1835 and tracked them and said, well, where were they all? And so among those 1835 people, the ones here that are orange, those are people that are still with Brigham Young. The ones here that are blue are people that are in some other faction of the religion. The people in the kind of gray color are people that have left the religion altogether. And then obviously the ones here that are dark are people who have died. So obviously Joseph and Hyrum Smith, Joseph Smith's father, Edward Partridge, some of these other people have died. So,
and sort of what this is conveying for those who don't have this beautiful graphic is just that in 12 years, a third have died, a third have gone on to other branches of Mormonism or have left Mormonism, and a third remained with Brigham. Right?
Exactly. So in other words, it's a complicated story. It's not just, we have this impression that, I think especially if you're in the LDS Church, that there's just one very straight and narrow path that is the entire flow of the whole thing. But it's a much more complicated story if you're looking and you take the original 12 apostles, in 1835, a total of 5 of them are with Brigham, including Brigham, right?
Right. Yeah, it's more a fourth are deceased, a fourth left Mormonism, a fourth are members of other branches, and a fourth stayed with Brigham. Yeah. Yeah, that's about a 25% retention rate.
or we also might say joined with Brigham.
Right.
On your perspective.
Yeah, got it. Okay, good.
All right, so that's like a lot of, let's say, the preface. And so when we're talking about all of the different division and schism, the number one moment, more over and above the collapse of the church in Kirtland or the Mormon Missouri War or any of these other things that happened during Joseph Smith's lifetime, the martyrdom event is the key thing that caused the succession crisis and the bulk of the different breakup of the different denominations that continue to this day. So in fact, none of the denominations that were founded before the martyrdom continue to exist. So all of them, the main branches that exist today, trace themselves back to division at 1844.
Got it.
Okay. So next thing here is just a little thing on the Smith family. So just as a background, the Smith family in Joseph Smith's person has been obviously operating the church, and Joseph has a bunch of different things where he is talking about there's an interconnection between blood and lineage and priesthood that probably is way less emphasized pretty much anywhere in the Restoration anymore, but was kind of still a big deal at the time, which is that in the Book of Mormon it predicts that Joseph Smith Jr. would be a descendant, of Joseph of Egypt, and that he would have this special role. He asserts that his father, a special role for his father, is presiding patriarch evangelist of the church. That place, which Joseph Smith said was a very high role, that it was kind of given to his father, that was then passed by lineage to his son Hyrum, kind of even without the structure of the first presidency having anything to say about it. So it is a kind of a lineage-based thing. There are ideas that the kind of vestiges of this to this day is there's this idea that Latter-day Saints are from the tribe of Ephraim, that they have either been adopted into that tribe or that they are actually being gathered as actual literal Ephraimites that are being kind of gathered together from amongst the whole world. I think that's the older view. Then the more recent view might be that they would either be adopted into it or it's not emphasized at all. So anyway, in many cases, the biography, the famous and wonderful biography of Emma Smith is called Mormon Enigma, and it's because Emma tends to be an enigma to Mormons because they wonder, well, how is it possible that the wife and the family of the founding prophet have nothing to do with the religion of the founding prophet? And so in this is because this is from the Utah perspective that the story is ever told, and so it's an enigma. But I just want to have this as a background to, okay, this is where the Smith family is at right at the time of the martyrdom. So Joseph Smith and all of the brothers, with the exception of William, who's the kind of least stable brother, and then have all died, and then the children of Joseph and Emma are quite young. So Joseph III is only 11.
Will you be talking later about all the people that had claims to the succession?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide.
Oh, is that okay? Because I was going to ask a question if you weren't. Oh, there it is. Okay, got it.
There we go.
All right.
Yeah. So we went through a little bit about what the structure of the church looked like, and the structure of the church is a little different from the structure of the church that exists in the LDS Church, where everything is very apostle-centric. It's apostle-centric in the LDS Church because the apostles took control of the church that became the LDS Church and have continually concentrated power in the quorum of the apostles ever since. But it wasn't necessarily, there is, in the LDS Church, there's this idea that the first presidency immediately dissolves when the president dies. There's nothing in Scripture that says that might happen. And so one of the major potential leaders in the succession alternative is the surviving member of the first presidency, Sidney Ridgon. Another one who came forward and certainly had a claim is Brigham Young, who was the president of the 12. William Marks was president of the High Council, and I kind of alluded to the idea that the High Council had a much, especially the headquarters High Council, had a much more central role in the early period than it does in especially in the LDS Church afterwards, when High Councils are essentially downgraded to just this very local stake level thing. There is no headquarters High Council. But at the time, the spheres of influence were divided. So the 12 were specifically in charge of missions, whereas the headquarters High Council had some supervisory roles over the stakes. We mentioned William Smith. So he was an apostle. He had claims to be presiding patriarch of the church, and it's not clear the level of where the presiding patriarch is that Joseph Smith made some extravagant statements that, this was the most exalted role in the whole church. And then, as we mentioned, so Joseph III had been designated as a successor in various blessings, as had David Whitmer, although David Whitmer was out of the church at that point. And then other people who also later emerge as challengers are people like Alphaeus Cutler and James Strang.
So just to be clear, you're saying that when Joseph Smith put his hands on Joseph Smith III, his head, he basically said, "You will be my successor."
I really doubt that he said that ever. My feeling, we don't have the text of it. The text that we ever had of a Joseph Smith III blessing was a Hoffman forgery.
Okay.
So we don't have the exact thing. We do have Hoffman that was so good because he found documents, in quotes, found documents that are the documents people presumed would exist based on what we knew in the record.
Right.
And so there were all kinds of recollections of multiple different blessings where it would have been things like, "You will be a prophet." So it's like a patriarchal blessing where Joseph Jr. is asserting that his son is going to be a prophet like him, right? So I really doubt it's that he said, "You will." It would be something as, "You will succeed me as prophet." I don't think it would have been like that. David Whitmer was designated that way at a particular moment. If Joseph fell or something, then David Whitmer would be the successor. But that had been much earlier, and a lot of things had happened since then, including David Whitmer leaving the church.
So when you say Joseph Smith III was designated as a successor, you mean that what happened?
That he was designated. In other words, that there was like a patriarchal blessing in which Joseph Smith Jr. was giving the blessing and said, "You're going to be a prophet and lead the church someday."
Okay, got it.
But not that you would take over right out when I die or something like that.
Got it.
And people remember that, and I think even Brigham Young has a recollection of that, and said, at some point or other, if the boy comes out to Utah, he'll have his place, right?
Right. Okay.
But that would have to mean that he would agree that that Brigham Young and what had happened in the intervening time had been legitimate,
right?
Which that ultimately didn't happen.
So regardless, it's unclear who Joseph intended to be his successor.
He intended Hyrum to be his successor.
Okay, right.
So
right.
I think it is clear who his successor was going to be. But Hyrum died.
Right. And so as a result, that created a vacuum that you're saying at least 9 people had potentially legitimate claims to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that these are people anyway who asserted claims, and it may well have been, William Marks didn't. But anyway, yes, I agree.
And Cutler, what was his claim?
So another thing that happened, that had happened very recently, and this is when I suggest that there's like this moving target and this grab bag of Joseph Smith's ministry. One of the last things that Joseph Smith was doing was he had restored, he'd originally restored the priesthood. The priesthood was restored before the church was restored. So there were priesthood, there were elders and things in the church before there was a church, or there were elders in the priesthood before there was a church. Also then, likewise, at the end in Nauvoo, Joseph had restored the kingdom. And so this was the kingdom of God on earth, and people were ordained as prophets, priests, and kings. And this was all done in the utmost secrecy because it's potentially could have been viewed as treason in the U.S. And whether or not it counts or if it's just a title, it was definitely it didn't only meant to be spiritual, because it was also meant to be literal, because they really believed that they were at the cusp of the second coming and the millennial kingdom was going to be established on earth. So there was this council of the kingdom of God on earth, which we tend to call now the Council of 50, because of the membership was supposed to be 50. And so the Council of 50 was ordered, after Joseph Smith being the senior-most member, it was ordered by age. And so Alphaeus Cutler, who was one of the, he was like the mason of the Masonic temple, and masonry is an important thing, especially in temples. He was one of the older members, and so he's 4th or 5th or whatever his number is. You can find out in Quinn's Mormon Hierarchy Origins volume. Cutler has a claim to being close to the top of the list out of the steering committee of the Council of 50. But the Council of 50, and he later then asserts, when the people above him have died, in the steering committee that he recalls being on, which was he's calling like a Council of 7. When they all died or failed to act, then he asserted that it was up to him to reestablish the church.
So anyone in the Council of 50 was sort of Mormon elite at the time it was created, true?
Well, there were actually a couple token non-Mormons,
right,
that were on the committee.
Okay.
So yes, it was meant to symbolically represent like the kingdom of the government of the world. And it was definitely elite people that were invited into it, and they were all sworn to just utmost secrecy. And the fact that that the secret had leaked, the fact that had gone to William Law, the fact that the prospectus of the Nauvoo expositor, mentioned that the secrets of the Council of 50 were going to be revealed in an upcoming issue, that probably is the thing that caused the real panic. And it led to the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor. It wasn't
more so than polygamy.
Everybody knew about polygamy.
Right.
So in other words, there had been expose after expose in the surrounding paper
since Kirtland, right?
Yeah, the people had heard rumors since Kirtland. It was very well known since John C. Bennett left the church. He went around and just exposed everything. He knew real information about Joseph's practice of polygamy. As a result of that, it was quite well known. It wasn't necessarily believed as much inside Nauvoo because it's not viewed as a credible source since he had left the church. But and he also was very flamboyant, and not everything he said was real, but he does have a lot of real information inside there, and so all of that stuff was really quite well known. But this Council of 50 stuff is the thing that really was was really important to Joseph Smith at the end of his life, and this was the thing that, after all of these new oaths of secrecy and things like that, that had all leaked out, was a cause for real alarm.
This is the deal when Joseph got ordained as king of the world, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. Lots of alternatives.
All right. So the thing that we know about in the next slide is this August 8th, 1844 showdown at Nauvoo. So ultimately, I mentioned William Marks as a potential claimant, the head of the presiding High Council. The Marks has the backing of Emma Smith, who is friend of their friends, and also she feels that he should step forward and become acting president of the church or acting leader of the church. Mark says no. The actual claimant here really is Sidney Ridgon, since he's the only surviving member of the first presidency, and so he supports Ridgon. Other Nauvoo reformers, people who might have been, let me say, the anti-polygamy faction, the anti-theocracy faction, what we might call anyway, progressive or whatever, members in Nauvoo, they're in disarray because they're people like William Law, who have actually just precedingly left the functional church in order to try to reform it from without. So William Law, by leaving, by saying this polygamy is going to be the end of us, by this Council of 50, this establishment of the kingdom, all these kind of things are things that we have to step back from the precipice. And they found the expositor, well, they're all out of the church for these very reasons leading up to the martyrdom in the first place. Meanwhile, amongst the 12, then there's this the rival successor to Sidney Rigdon's claim that comes back from this mission to try to get Joseph Smith elected president. All of the different elders and apostles and everybody are out campaigning for Joseph Smith's campaign to be president. Brigham Young comes back to Nauvoo. He rushes back to Nauvoo, and they have a kind of a showdown where both Sidney Ridgon and Brigham Young make their cases for why they should, why in Sidney Rigdon's case, why he should be named guardian of the church, and Brigham Young's case, why there can't be a successor, why there can't be a guardian, but instead the 12 should be called upon to simply lead the church in the place of the first presidency. And Brigham Young has at his backing both this inner group of core leaders, people who have been practicing polygamy in secret, people for whom, if Sidney Ridgon were to become president of the church, everything that they've done, not only all of their kind of blessings and sealings and eternal afterlife, but even their just basic function of what they've been doing, their families would all come into horrible question and censure if an anti-polygamist were to become head of the church. So obviously they're quite in support of having Brigham Young be in charge, as are then all of this huge group of British converts, people who are very familiar with the 12 because the 12 are in fact the missionaries of the church who have converted all these people.
So Sidney Ridgon was never down with polygamy?
No.
Yeah.
He's an opponent of polygamy. Although he's unlike William Law, who left and wanted to expose polygamy, or James Bennett, who wrote exposés without being interested in reforming the church at all. He was just making it for his own benefit. William Law, he left the church. He wanted to expose this in order to reform the church. He started a reformed Mormon church. He was hoping to right what he felt was the thing had gone off course, and he was hoping to right the course. He said later in an interview that if he'd had a sense in the world, he never would have done it. He would have just kept quiet. He would have moved away and sold his property and lived a happy life, completely having forgotten about it. Instead, he risked it all. He wanted to reform the whole thing and ended up losing everything.
Right.
So they were out, and now I've forgotten the first part of the question. So anyway, so Sidney Ridgon, and so Sidney Ridgon though had not, his opposition had remained quiet. So in other words, he was not having exposés.
Right.
He didn't side with William Law. He didn't side with Bennett. Joseph Smith had propositioned his daughter, and which obviously Sidney found, I think, horribly offensive. So did his daughter, but they kept it quiet. In other words, they were willing to work with Joseph Smith and not to expose the thing as a scandal.
Right. Okay. Excellent.
So the Showdown is a horrible fiasco for Sidney Rigdon. There's a wonder they've actually got the LDS Church Archives has recently found the shorthand transcript, or being able to translate the shorthand for the first time. So we actually, I guess, have Sidney's speech, and then his speech is not well received. Brigham Young's speech is incredibly well received. Ultimately, people are very confident that Brigham Young is able to step into that role. People later remember it as a miraculous transfiguration, even. And then ultimately, there's a rebuttal period given. Sidney Rigdon, instead of standing up to give the rebuttal himself, he has somebody stand up for him, who ultimately endorses Brigham Young. So it is a fiasco for Sidney. So anyway,
and we've talked about this before, but there's no contemporary evidence that anyone actually witnessed Brigham Young's face or voice, transforming into Joseph's. That's sort of creative, informed memory.
It's a later memory.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit what actually happened, because at the time Brigham Young was not arguing that he should be the successor. He wasn't then set. They didn't, after he won, they didn't just sit down and ordain him to be prophet or something like that. Rather, he became acting. He started to be acting president of the church, and the 12 were made functionally to serve as the first presidency. And so it became kind of a corporate leadership of the 12. And in fact, for the time period, people weren't calling Brigham Young's faction the Brighamites at that point. They were calling them the 12ites, because the 12 were the leaders. And it's only later, when Joseph III emerges as leader of the Reorganization, that and by the time that Brigham Young is president of his church, and it is not the 12 that are leading it, that people have to remember that history a little bit differently, in light of the new reality of a Brigham Young very well established as head of the church in Utah, and this challenger who has Joseph Smith's name, who looks like Joseph Smith, who reminds everybody of Joseph Smith, and who is potentially an enormous threat to Brigham Young's control of the church in Utah, although ultimately it does not prove to be.
Right. But there's no contemporary writings of any transfiguration ever happening.
That's right.
Okay.